We're going to start. No reason to punish those of you who showed up on time. Thank you for coming. My name's Mike Pesci. I'm the president of Associate Community Management. And to my right is Dave Ramsey, who's going to talk about FHA approvals today. And I'll let him talk about his long and storied resume. I'm going to talk about Department of Community Affairs 5-year inspections. In terms of formatting, our plan is to split this evenly, 30 minutes each, since we only have an hour. I think each of our goals will be to finish our presentation in no more than 25 minutes, leaving time at the end of our respective presentations for questions or comments that you may have. So that's the plan. And before we start, it's always helpful to know who's in the audience. So can I just ask for a raise of hands, board members in the audience? Lots. Managers? Who else? Professionals? Lawyers, accountants, engineers? Gotcha, Lynn. Anybody else that I didn't cover? You thought you were going somewhere else and ended up here? Okay. Well, again, thank you for the opportunity to talk about two topics, each of which are dealing with government or quasi-governmental issues that our associations deal with. So let me start with, I'm going to talk about DCA inspections. The focus will be on, since I'm a manager, what our role is in the process, but I'm hoping that when you hear what our role is, if you're a board member, if you're a professional, some of these things will ring true, and we'll give you some practical advice as to how to get from here to there. So the DCA itself is the Department of Community Affairs. It's a large state regulatory agency. It's got a variety of different functions. When, for example, a car runs off an amusement park ride, the DCA shows up to try to figure out why it happened. In our world, their jurisdiction comes as a result of what's called the Hotel and Multiple Dwelling Act. It's a statute enacted about 50 years ago. And they have, of course, issued and promulgated regulations under that act. And that's what brings us where we are. I think most of us, I think everybody understands that the original purpose of the Hotel and Multiple Dwelling Act and regulations really was not focused on community associations, because frankly there weren't many of them when this came about years ago. So what instead has happened over time, though, is when community associations came into being, the initial reaction was, well, this can't apply to us. This is about rental apartment buildings, right? To make sure that irresponsible landlords aren't preying upon their unsuspecting tenants. And the answer came back fairly quickly, not so fast. It does, in fact, apply to community associations, because the truth is, if you've got a tripping hazard sidewalk in a community associations, it's no less of a safety issue than a tripping hazard in a rental apartment building. The tougher issue, and the one we still struggle with today, is, well, what about within units? What jurisdiction ought the state have to tell people how to behave within their homes that they own? I can tell you, when we have communities that are going through this 5-year process for the first time, the reaction is almost universal when we tell them they're coming in, they need to get access to your home, and the question is, how can this be? This is America. And we remind them that, yes, but this is New Jersey. And the truth is, they do have a right to gain access. One of the problems with this whole area is that the state doesn't do a good job of codifying a lot of custom and practice that's taken place over the years. You said this is New Jersey. So one of the issues that I'll touch upon in a moment is the scope of the inspection, and understanding that within units, what they're supposed to be looking for in owner-occupied units are health and safety issues. They're not supposed to be telling Mrs. Jones, who owns her unit, that she's living in a pigsty and ought to paint her kitchen. If she wants to live that way, that's up to her. If, however, she doesn't have a properly operating smoke or CO detector, that affects the safety of everybody around her, and the state does have jurisdiction to deal with that. So we'll talk a little bit about how you get clarification on that issue. So these inspections happen every 5 years by statute. They're done by either employees of the state of New Jersey, whose job it is to do 5-year cyclical inspections, or they're done by the state typical local housing inspector deputized by the state for that purpose. We don't get to pick, they do. And I think it's fair to say over time what's happened is the state is doing many of the inspections in the larger urban areas, primarily because the local inspectors behave so badly that they got ousted. So a lot of the suburban communities that I suspect most of you are in, you will find that it's the local inspector. That's a blessing and a curse. It may be a housing inspector that you have a relationship with. The curse is it may be a housing inspector that you have a relationship with. And the issue is if you have and we'll talk a little bit about how do you contest findings in after the inspection. It's tougher to contest it when it's the local housing inspector, because the harder you push, the more he or she potentially can take it out on you for the next 4 years. So again, we don't have a choice, whatever it is, but there are ramifications to one or the other. So how does this all start? And by the way, I should note that you've got a handout that provides more flesh to the skeleton. So my PowerPoint is just dealing with bullet points, and it corresponds to the bullet points in the handout. But if you're having trouble sleeping tonight, read that. Hopefully, it'll tell you a little bit more. So how does this come about? So what happens initially is we get notice that the state's going to do their inspection. It comes in a variety of ways. Ideally, it ought to be sent by notice to whoever the recipient is on the state records for that community. And it ought to come to the management company, it ought to come to the board, whoever it is. We oftentimes find, however, that they're just sticking the notice on the property, dropping it through the door, giving it to the superintendent. It's a very inconsistent approach. The important thing is when you get that notice, make sure number one, that the notice is in the name of the proper party. I spoke recently to a fellow manager who said, he's just getting fines now issued in the name of his management company. Well, that's probably because the name of the entity on the account is the management company. It ought not be. It ought be the name of the association, because they're the party who's responsible for the property and responding to and abating whatever violations are issued. So when you get the notice, number one, make sure it's properly addressed. Number two, they will talk about when we want to come in. And oftentimes, they don't give us enough time. So oftentimes, they say, well, be here next Tuesday. And the answer is, oh, no. That doesn't work. If we have an obligation to gain you access to units, you have an obligation to give us sufficient time to be able to do that in a reasonable way. I've found in 95% of the time, they're very amenable to that. I had one guy last summer who, it was much more important that I not interrupt his vacation schedule, and I had to push him to finally get enough time. But ultimately, you'll get enough time. And the important thing with the notice is to make sure that the state gives you a formal notice as to when they're coming, what is their authority, and what are they looking for. I've oftentimes they balk at that. Well, we're gonna look at the stuff on our checklist. Well, I understand that, but we need the opportunity to give notice to the owners of what we're doing and why. And the important message from us is it's not us who's doing it. So you want that state letter on their letterhead enclosed with your letter to make sure that this isn't something we dreamt up to make owners' lives more miserable. It's a state requirement. All we are is the messenger. So that, make sure they give you that notice. I've gotten some pushback on that, and I just keep pushing. And eventually they'll give you the notice and enclose it in your notice. So once we give the notice to the unit owners, we hopefully at that point know when they're coming. And there is an obligation for us to, and by the way, Dave and I will no doubt be interrupting each other because that's what we do. Dave is very, well-versed in this from a legal perspective. The access issue, I think, is one of the hotter issues today because, we're obligated to seek to provide access. But in most of our communities, I suspect in virtually all of them here, we don't have keys. We don't want keys, and we don't have keys. So therefore, when they say, give us access, the most we can do is ask for it. And we could tell people they're coming, on Tuesday morning between 8 and 12. If you're working, feel free to leave your key with somebody else and tell us who's got it. Have a neighbor be in the unit, but it's important that we be able to show a trail where we sought to provide access. Our position has historically been we have no obligation to guarantee access. And if the state doesn't get access to a unit, they have the power to issue a warrant. We don't.
Well, they have the power to go into court,
Yeah.
get a warrant
Yeah.
to inspect the property. Are you going to talk about they used to have an 80% rule, and then now they're looking for 100%?
Why don't you hit that?
All right. So it used to be that if they got 80% of the units inspected, they were happy. They moved on. They figured that was a big enough sampling that they would know what was going on. More recently, I would say over the last year, 18 months or so, they've now indicated they want, 100% access. And they've often tried to intimidate, not everybody, not every inspector, but some of the inspectors try to intimidate managers into believing it's their obligation to get them into the unit. The regulations are very clear. It is not their obligation, and the manager should not be intimidated by that.
And we've been cited, for these renegade inspectors who think it's our job or they don't want to do their job. And we've been issued fines, which we've routinely appealed from because it's just not right. But you need to be able to show a paper trail that we did in fact try. The important thing also in the notice to the owners is, once again, tell them what they're looking for within their homes. I mean, I've glossed over the exterior issues. I mean, those are pretty meat and potatoes stuff. Are there tripping hazards? They're not looking for a little bit of peeling paint on the building facade, although we have been cited for that. But it is major, again, safety issues that they're looking for outside. But it's critical to know what they're looking for inside. And again, in my handout, I've talked a little bit about what the typical issues are, and they are, in fact, properly operating smoke and CO detectors. It's making sure that there's the proper door closers in buildings that access common hallways. Those of you in high-rise or mid-rises, this becomes relevant. But whatever it is, make sure you have that conversation with the inspector in advance of his inspection. You want to make sure you understand what he's looking for, and frankly, many times we've had to tell them, this is not a rental apartment building, and the scope that you've just described is inappropriate and overly broad. And oftentimes they'll come to grips with that. The initial notice to the owners also is your first opportunity to tell them that the obligation to either not have violations in the first instance or to abate them thereafter is on them. We're not going in and abating people's violations within their units, and to the extent that those violations are ultimately not abated in the second inspection that we'll talk about, any fines that are issued by the state are then going to be passed on to that delinquent owner. I should say that we fought the battle years ago to try to get the state to deal directly with those delinquent owners, and they refuse. From their perspective, they'd rather deal with one entity for a 100 or 200 unit building rather than 100 or 200 units. So that battle's been fought and lost, and it is what it is, but we need to start laying the groundwork as early as possible to make sure that we can lay off whatever fines are issued through noncompliance on the owners who are in a position to abate. So the inspection itself, I think the most important practical issue here is somebody needs to be with that inspector on behalf of the association, whether it be the manager in a professionally managed association, whether it be a board member, whether it be the superintendent, although that's a scary proposition in some buildings. The important thing, and why do you want to be there? You want to be there, number one, because being with the inspector gives you an opportunity to influence perhaps whether an issue is cited or not. It also gives you the ability to perhaps abate the violation on the spot. One of the things I found to be valuable is in the buildings we manage, many of them garden apartment conversions that still have battery-operated smoke and CO detectors. The issue is it operative? I found we tell our managers or superintendents to carry around a box of 9-volt batteries. It's a lot cheaper to buy those batteries and stick it in real time and avoid the violation than to deal with the violation after the fact. If that battery costs $1.99, believe me, just the letter and the stamp to that owner saying you got to fix this now costs you more than that. And the other reason to be there is, and to take notes as to what they find, although not all of them are terribly transparent. Somehow they think this is like a big secret, and you'll find out in months when you see our report, is to the extent that they are communicative, you want to take notes, because you won't get the inspection report for months after the inspection. And to the extent that it's clear to you that they're going to cite you for A, B, or C, the sooner you know about the A, B, and C, the sooner you can get to abating those violations, assuming that you acknowledge that they're real. If you wait for the inspection report, they typically don't give you a great deal of time to turn it around. Okay, so the violation report. So now the inspection has happened, and months later, we're now going to receive a violation report. It will, even in our pristine, perfect communities, the DCA doesn't know from perfect, and they're going to find something, and you're going to find that it will be hard to believe that when you drive into a community that looks beautiful that they found stuff, but they routinely do. So the key is to get this report and to review it for accuracy. You will find sometimes that they're just wrong. You will other times find that they've cited something that either is not clear or you, in fact, think ought not be a violation. We're not without recourse. You have the right, after review of the report, to say, we don't think this is a legitimate violation. Now, how do you do that? You appeal. And the appeal is tricky. You've got 15 days from receipt of the report to file that appeal with Trenton. And that appeal must be specific as to which lines you're appealing from and the basis for the contesting of that violation. In a perfect world, that ought to be done by association counsel. I can tell you over the years, we have some associations who say, Mike, you can do that, right? The answer is they will accept an appeal from management or a board member initially just to get it out there. On the other hand, you're going to need counsel should it not be compromised in the event there's ultimately a hearing. The watchword, though, is to the extent that you can retain counsel up front, please do so, because the last thing a lawyer wants to find out is, here's the file, and they say, you did what? Or you didn't do what? So, make sure you tee it up with them in advance.
Just two real quick comments. One of the things that you find in some of these violation notices, you don't even know what the violation is for. You cannot tell from the way they articulated the violation what they're talking about. Yep. And sometimes a call over there would be sufficient, and then you'll then find out. Sometimes it's not sufficient. And the second thing is, when you appeal, they expect you to tell you why you're appealing. What's the reason? That takes some knowledge of the regulations and so on. And very often, and Mike, you may be getting into this, so I don't want to steal any thunder. You can settle the violation, and they're very open to doing that. And the better you articulate it, the better the chance that will happen.
Exactly. So now you also have the ability, if you don't seek to contest the violation but need more time to abate it, oftentimes these are weather-related issues. So you get the violation report in November that says that in 60 days you have to fix the lifted concrete walkway slabs. You're not doing that in February. They are typically very amenable to that. But understand that if you seek an extension on a given violation, you waive your right to appeal. Now, you can, however, appeal from some issues and seek extensions as to others. So it's not a all or nothing, but it is all or nothing on a particular issue. Okay? And once you then have satisfied yourself that the report is what it is and you appeal from those that you need to, seek extensions for others, you want to send notice to each individual owner what we do is with a copy of the page applicable to their unit saying, this has been found in your unit, it's your obligation to abate that violation. Frankly, where I think this gets a little tricky, and Dave may have a thought on it, is what if The association thinks that the violation is legitimate and bona fide, or at least it's not worth the effort to contest it, but the owner thinks it is. So it's in our court. I think, frankly, we have jurisdiction to make that judgment, but it doesn't make it any easier, with the owner who says, they're nuts, how come you caved? But it's like anything else as board members, it's lonely at the top, you get to make that decision. Okay, so, and at that point, we're telling the owner again, there's going to be a reinspection in roughly this time frame. Between now and then, you need to abate this violation, because the next time they come, if it's not abated, there will be fines issued and you're going to be responsible for them. So the reinspection then is done. It's typically months from the initial inspection, typically a couple, 3 months from the notice of the report itself. And as Dave said, the fines are heavy-handed. I'm relatively convinced, though, it's like, when Macy's puts stuff on sale, they double it first, then they reduce it by half. They will routinely cut the fine in half. But that may not be fair, so it doesn't mean you got to accept that. Sometimes they're happy to make deals, but the deal you're going to have to evaluate with the advice of counsel as to whether or not it makes sense. Now, for all of the benefit of this, they charge associations. And there's a schedule in the regulations. It went up about 35% a couple, 3 years ago. So I've attached to the handout a schedule of the fees, and they're on a sliding scale. It's more per unit with very small associations and less per unit as they grow. Just to give you an idea, I did the math this morning. For a 200-unit community, the inspection will now cost about $5,600. So it's not an insignificant nut. What we suggest our associations do, because every 5 years this is a hit to the budget, is potentially put that as a line item in your deferred maintenance schedule. Funded $1,100 a year in my 200-unit example, so that the money's there and you don't have to worry about, first of all, remembering to budget it in the 5th year, and second of all, finding the money to do it.
And they charge you for every reinspection.
That's
too.
right, and the re-inspections cost as well. The other thing you should know is there is a lead paint surcharge levied upon associations, and lead paint stopped being used in paint in the United States in 1978. So theoretically, if you're a post-1978 community, you don't have any lead paint, but you have to prove to the state that you, in fact, are post-1978 in order for them to exempt you. And I think the last time I looked, I think the fee is $25 per unit. So it's not insignificant. In many cases, that is the same, is equal to, if not greater than, the inspection fee itself. So you want to be sure that you just don't routinely get the bill, which comes with the initial violation report, and pay it, because if there's a lead paint surcharge on there and your property was built in 1995, they have no right to levy it, but they will until you push back.
And no matter how many times you prove to them before that you were post-1978, the next inspection will still have that on it.
Yeah, exactly.
You have to pay that every time for the inspection for the lead-based paint, even if you prove that you don't have it?
No, but what Dave's suggesting is you may have to prove in 5 years, once again, that you're exempt, because you would think, once ought to be enough, but it ain't. So, let me just finish, and then I'll entertain a couple of questions. Exemptions. Oh, I'm not very good at this, am I? Exemptions. So there is a process to get exempted. First of all, those of you who are here from single-family home communities, you're not subject. It's multiple dwelling units. So if you're a single-family home, you're not subject. It's the one break you get. If you're multiple dwelling units, however, there is a process, and I've attached the criteria for that as well to the handout. There is a process to seek an exemption. It has to do with, it's got to be a building of 4 or less units, and it has to have certain firewall construction in order to qualify for the exemption. I frankly, and we frankly, haven't been terribly successful in obtaining these exemptions. And the other qualification, which is bizarre, is that the units must be owner-occupied. And it's never clear to me, although the regs are a little bit clearer today, what happens if in a 4-unit building, some of the units are owner-occupied and others are not. And I think the latest interpretation is you literally could have a unit subject in a building, and the 3 other units, if rented, are not subject. Or, I'm sorry, other way around. But there's a benefit to getting exempt because then they don't charge you. They don't charge you and they don't inspect. Now, if you think there's some benefit to the inspection, you don't care. But most people, I think, view this as more onerous than it is beneficial.
You got to get an engineer who's willing to certify.
And that's the issue.
And that's the problem.
And early on, by the way, their position was, well, and we won't take that engineering certification based on the plans. They need to inspect every unit. Then, please. So you might as well pay the darn fee. So in any event, but take a look at the exemption. And from a timing standpoint, make sure that you seek the exemption. You don't want to seek the exemption when they tell you we're coming out, because it doesn't happen that fast. So, and what oftentimes happens is, all right, we'll deal with it this time, then we'll seek the exemption. And next thing you know, you're 5 years later and you still didn't do it. So put it on your radar. If you think you're entitled to this exemption, or if you're a townhome community with the requisite firewalls, seek it, or at least, assess whether or not you're eligible for it. And finally, so what's at the end of the tunnel here? What's at the end of the tunnel is what's called a certificate of inspection. What in the industry, the parlance is called a green card. It's called a green card. It's a green card, a little postcard-sized card that says, "Okay, you're done. You've abated whatever violations exist, and you're now free and clear until the next inspection." Now, it may well take a year and a half, 2 years. We took over one property. There were 2 5-year inspections still pending, and it took us a year to abate them all. By the time we were done, we started all over with a 3rd. But the important thing is you want a green card. If you're a management company taking over a new property from pre-existing somebody, ask for the green card, or at least know, are there any pending violations from a DCA report that we ought know about. Okay, I think I left 3 minutes for questions. Somebody had their hand up before. Yes?
Area, if you have lead pipes, and it goes right through it, bolting, right through it. How do they handle that? Because of lead pipe.
I honestly don't know. I mean, I've never been cited for lead pipes in a violation report.
Looking at the individual owner,
They're looking inside of the units for lead paint.
but that's it.
Well, yes and no. I mean, if you have a pre-78 building, they also will look, for example, if you have common hallways that have windows and window sills that have paint on it, that's an area that I've seen cited as well.
So, thank you.
Yes?
Is there a possibility that a condominium association could do the inspection themselves?
The question was, can a condo association do the inspection themselves? There's actually a provision in the law dealing with and providing for self-inspections. We have never done one in any community I've been involved in. We talked to the state about it. They pretend it doesn't even exist, the mechanism. And I think at the end of the day, the conclusion was there's a great deal of liability taken on by the association if you go down that road. Whether you think this is necessary or not, when the state cites it, you react to it. If you do it yourself and you miss something, and God forbid there's an incident, you just took on a liability otherwise would not have had. Yes?
If you had done already, testing
Right.
over 5 years, do you always have to do it every 5 years?
Good question. I should have mentioned that. No. So you need to be able to demonstrate. If you're post-78, it doesn't mean that you have to pay that lead surcharge. It means, however, that you have to pay it unless you can show that you're either lead safe or forget the other phrase, lead abated, something like that, lead free. So, and there are ways to do that and to get certifications to that effect. And if you submit that, once again, once ought to be enough. But Dave's suggesting that, don't lose that file, because you'll likely have to give it to him again in 5 years.
Good. I
Yes.
don't want to do it every 5 years,
Right. Okay, last question, so I don't want to encroach upon Dave's time. Go.
What if a community is 13 years old and has never had a DCA inspection?
Okay. Yeah, that's what we call don't ask, don't tell. Well, let me talk a little bit about how does that happen, and then I'll shut up. So I think it's fair to say every community we manage that we've been involved in that was once a rental apartment building is on the DCA list because they were rental apartment buildings, they were registered as such, and have been, considered subject to the Hotel and Multiple Dwelling Act ever since. What happens, however, with other communities that were built from the ground up as associations is that it's only on the list if the developer registered it at the time of initial approvals. And registering it is separate and apart from registering the community to sell units. Same department, by the way, same DCA, but the PRED people apparently don't walk down the hall and say, here's our list.
Their
We just
computer
registered-
systems don't even match.
No,
up.
they don't even match. So you would think that it shouldn't be so hard. So if you're 13 years in, you have to make a judgment that I'm not going to, counsel you on one way or the other. Do you want to wake that sleeping dog? There's a lot of sleeping dogs out there. I've actually heard that one of the things they now ask their inspectors to do is ride around. And to the extent that they see condominium or association on the front lawn of any community, put it on the list.
They're also going to the town.
Yeah,
And they're
and
asking
they're
the
asking
town
towns.
what they know.
So they're doing better. By the way, I guess the follow-up to your question is, well, and do you have any recourse if they say, well, wait a minute, you've never done this? No. What you then say is, oh, thank God we missed 2 of these. And, so the fact that they do have a right to fix it, they don't have a right, obviously, to fix it retroactively, and you've saved 2 inspection fees and the rigors of them.
By the way, Mike, I know where these people live. What do you think it's worth for us not to tell DCA
Yeah, that's
where
right.
they are?
That's right. This is, talk about leverage. I'm going to turn it over to Dave Ramsey.
I'm leaving now.
Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about this morning is FHA condominium project approval. How many of you are in condominiums or manage condominiums? Okay. How many of you already have FHA approval? Only a couple. And how many of you would like to have FHA approval? 2, 3. I said to Mike, if no hands raised, I'd say we were done. But
I saw 3, so you're talking about.
yeah. So we're talking to them, but maybe you'd be interested after you hear a little bit more about this. So, first question is, how does FHA facilitate financing? Well, they don't buy mortgages. They don't give mortgages. All the FHA does is insure mortgages. And why do they insure mortgages? Because their charge from day one was that for people who couldn't put a lot of money down, which is typically 20%, but maybe not even 10%, they wanted to facilitate people to be able to buy homes. So the FHA would say to lenders, as long as you follow this criteria and we're paid an insurance premium, if you have to foreclose and you don't get your full amount back, we will cover the difference. That encouraged lenders to give mortgages on a low down payment basis. So that's really what that's about. Okay, so what's the cost of that insurance to the borrower? Well, it's a sliding scale percentage based upon the amount put down and the loan amount. So it can range from 0.45% per year to 1.05% per year, plus 1.75% at closing, which can be financed in the FHA loan. So if FHA is loaning 97%, you can get 97% plus that 1.75% of the mortgage premium. Depending on the down payment, the premium does expire once the loan to value ratio is 78%. In other words, the loan is at 78% of the value of the home. It's supposed to go away automatically. If anybody has an FHA loan, sometimes it doesn't go away automatically, and you've actually got to point it out to the lender that it's now time to change that. Now, at one point, FHA was insuring 30% of all the loans in the country. And this was like in 2009, after the big mortgage meltdown. FHA was kind of a lender of last resort or an insurer of last resort, and they were doing 30% of the market. Now it's about 10% of the market. And there's a number of reasons for that. One of the reasons is because of this condo project approval. A lot of associations don't want to go through the effort. They don't go through the effort. They don't renew it because right now it has to be renewed every 2 years. Frankly, it's a pain in the neck. So they took out a large part of the market by doing that. The other big change is that Fannie Mae is now offering mortgages or buying mortgages with a 3% down basis. That was the meat and potatoes of FHA. Now, is there still a market? Yes. Why? Because they have lower FICO score requirements, and people just know FHA loans, I can put down a minimum amount of money, and they will go to FHA. So that's where we are today on this. Why should condos care? Well, why is it important? And I'm going to tell you the pluses and minuses of this. First of all, you want as many buyers as possible to be able to buy your units, okay? The more buyers chasing the units, the higher the price of the units is going to be. And that's just a plus. And that, you know, the question I've had arise is, do we have to get FHA approval? Well, so far, there is absolutely no case law that says that a board that doesn't get FHA approval is somehow violating an obligation that they have. Now, different communities are different because there's a maximum FHA mortgage. You know, FHA mortgages tend to be more that medium income kind of people want. That's when they want FHA mortgages. Typically, your very high-end communities where you would have to have a higher income in order to sustain a mortgage, they're not interested in FHA financing for the most part because their buyers aren't FHA people. So depending on your community, if you're cutting out a part of the community, the mortgages, because it is a moderate income community, you can understand that people may get upset if you don't get FHA financing. So there is an issue there. Prior to 2010, the FHA insured on a spot loan basis. Spot loan means that anybody could go get an FHA mortgage, they'd send a questionnaire to the condo association, the manager would have to fill it out, and if they answered all the questions the right way, FHA would insure the mortgage. Starting as of February 1, 2010, there were no more spot loans. That was because of the large mortgage meltdown. Fannie Mae took a huge amount of hits as a result of that meltdown, and now, I guess, although we've never been able to get the information out of them, I guess FHA decided that they're going to blame the condos for some reason. So they did, and they started with this condo approval, project approval. So now FHA will only insure mortgages if they have given the condo approval. There's certain projects that are ineligible: condo hotels, timeshares, houseboat projects. We don't have too many of those in New Jersey. More than one dwelling unit per condo unit. We don't have too many of those either. And if it's not primarily residential. Now that we're getting more of because you're getting a mix of floor space in some of the more city-oriented condominiums, and it depends what your percentages are as to whether you can be eligible. Is there anything else? You don't need an approval for a site condominium. What's a site condominium? That's a condominium where you have standalone, not adjoining units, standalone units. You can get individual spot loan approval from the FHA for those standalone units. But if they're attached units, you cannot. The other ironic, strange thing is you could have two projects standing side by side, both townhouse projects. One's fee simple. They each have a little lot. The other is a condo. Condo's got to get project approval. The fee simple does not have to get condo project approval. Makes no sense, but we are talking about the government. So, okay, there are certain criteria that the FHA puts in place. So here are your criteria. Minimum project has to be at least 2 units, and that's not such a big deal. Insurance must have property and liability insurance, and when applicable, flood and fidelity insurance. We're going to get to that in a little bit more detail. Not more than 25% of the total floor space can be devoted to commercial use. But if you have space that's, for instance, parking, that's not considered a commercial use. So if it's parking for your unit owners, you get to count all of the garage space in that building as part of the 100%. So it's not as intimidating as you might think to get below that 25%. No more than 10% of the units can be owned by one owner. That doesn't apply to developer-owned units. And if it's a conversion, the sponsor must have sold 90% of the units. In addition, as far as transfer of control of the board, assuming you haven't already gone through transition, it has to occur no later than 120 days after the date which 75% of the units are sold. Now, New Jersey law is that it has to be within 30 days of when 75% of the units are sold. So I'm not even going to cover the rest of this slide because New Jersey law requires that as a matter of fact. Reserves. Now, here's a big issue, and a lot of condo associations run up against this issue when trying to get approval. The FHA reviews the budget for all of the projects, and this review must determine that the budget is adequate and includes allocations line items to ensure sufficient funds are available to maintain and preserve all amenities and features unique to the condominium project. Secondly, you have to have capital reserves equaling at least 10% of the total budget each year. So if your budget were $100,000, $10,000 minimum has to be going into the capital reserve account. Most condos, it's pretty easy to meet, but I have seen some that don't. And even though they're fully funding, they don't. What can you do in the alternative? You can have a reserve study by an engineer that was completed in the last 24 months, and you're reserving in accordance with that reserve study. You're okay then.
Dave, I've tried and successfully many times to include the deferred maintenance contribution with the reserves. You got any advice there?
Yeah, I mean, I would throw it in when you
If
first
it gets
do it.
me over the threshold, then I'm otherwise not there.
Exactly. I would try it in the first go-around. Now, you may get some reviewers who will come back at you on that. Some won't. It all depends on the reviewer you're dealing with. So, but you might as well try. Okay. Property, now we're going to talk about insurance, because this is a little bit, there are parts of this that for some associations is difficult. First of all, the association must have insurance equal to the current replacement cost of the condominium, except land, foundation, and items not usually insured, like landscaping. You just wouldn't, those are not insurable items. If the association does not maintain all-in coverage, then the buyer has to get walls-in coverage under an HO6 policy, but that's not the association's issue. So you have single entity insurance, which the vast majority of condominiums do, you're fine. Here's the one that often associations don't match up with, fidelity insurance. It must equal 3 times the total monthly assessments plus the total amount of reserves. And by the way, if you're counting in your reserves the deferred maintenance,
Oh, no,
then you better have that insured.
We wouldn't count it there.
You better have it there for that too. In addition, if you're managed professionally, the manager must also have fidelity coverage that covers the people working for the management company. So I've had associations that just don't have that amount of fidelity insurance. It's not that expensive to get. It really is cheap. So, and I really, frankly, that standard is a reasonable standard to have. So I don't complain about that. Flood insurance. If you are in a flood zone that requires flood insurance, then you have to purchase the minimum, or actually the maximum, that the NFIP, National Flood Insurance Program, provides for. Now, that happens to be $250,000 per unit. Okay, now unless the value of your units is less, and if you can prove the value of your units is less, then you could do it for less. Frankly, there's very few communities in New Jersey that would be able to establish that the units are less. And by the way, if you're a mid-rise or high-rise building that's in a flood zone, even though the flood may never get up above the first floor, you've got to insure every unit on every floor to the amount required. Frankly, that sounds crazy, but the fact of the matter is the damage that can occur on the first floor or the basement, et cetera, is more than you would otherwise be insured for, so it's not such a terrible thing. However, we all know flood insurance has gone up substantially, so it's expensive. But if you're in a flood zone, you got to have that insurance anyway, because Fannie Mae won't buy mortgages either in your community. So really, this is nothing more than is present in the normal mortgage marketplace in any event. Okay, if you've got any pending litigation, HUD must review and approve the pending litigation. Collection litigation is not an issue, so they don't care about that. That's fine. Other litigation. HUD wants to know what impact the litigation could have on the owners, okay? Generally speaking, if it's litigation that's covered by insurance, you have a slip and fall case. You're being defended by the insurance carrier. You know, unless somebody's claiming, you know, somebody, God forbid, drowned in the pool and is claiming $25 million in damages and that exceeds your coverage, they're not going to care unless it's an extraordinary case like that. But if it's litigation concerning transition, it's going to be very difficult to get HUD to approve, because HUD is going to want some kind of representation by the attorney that if the case goes totally south, that there's not going to be any special assessments of the unit owner. No
You give
attorney.
those routinely, right?
Yeah, we give those out like candy. No attorney is going to give a letter that says that. So if you're in transition litigation, you probably should wait until you're done. On delinquencies, not more than 15% of the units can be more than 30 days late. There is a possibility of an exception, and that's on a case-by-case basis that allows up to 20% of the units under particular criteria. Now, that includes every delinquent account. So if you've got some person you've been carrying for years who shows $15 outstanding because they underpaid one time or they never paid a late charge, that's got to be included in the delinquency. So let's say you're hovering right around when you include all of those little items that are hanging out there. You're now over the 10%. What do? You waive those. You give them up, okay? You may not want to, but it's easier to give them up than to have to explain to HUD why you've still got them on your books. Okay, how do you obtain project approval? Well, there's several ways. A lender can do it at the lender's own expense. That's relatively rare. There's only a few lenders in the country who are actually authorized to do it. We have run into a couple of situations, however, where lenders thought they might be able to have a fairly high number of loans that they could give in a particular community. That's the only time they're going to be interested. They're not going to do this on a one-off basis. They're only going to do it if they think there's a number of loans they could make in the community. They could go ahead, but they need the association's cooperation because the information that's required almost has to come from the association. And I've seen situations, frankly, where the association didn't want the lender to go get FHA approval. And they simply didn't cooperate with the lender and the approval was never granted. Of course, the person who was trying to sell their house to the person who was getting the FHA mortgage were not happy campers. So just something to keep in mind. Now, the other process, which covers probably 98% of the FHA approvals, it's called the HRAP process. This can be pursued directly with HUD. And while the association could do it itself, or they could ask their manager to do it themselves, or the board could try to do it themselves, I wouldn't recommend it. Because if you see the list of what you've got to do, the representations you have to make, et cetera, it's kind of overwhelming. And I've seen boards who tried it and generally gave up somewhere along the process. So there are outside services. I mean, all you have to look for is FHA project approval, and you'll come up with a whole bunch of services who do it. I will tell you that most of those services simply collect the data and submit it. They're not going to help you get the data. They're just going to collect it and submit it. And if FHA comes back, as they often do, and says, oh, we have a problem with this, they're going to say, oh, FHA has a problem with this. How are you going to solve it? Okay. Your attorney can also do this. And while we don't do a lot of this work, I know a lot of firms who represent them, associations do it. There's a couple of advantages to have your attorney do it. One is they're familiar with the community, they're familiar with the governing documents, they're familiar with everything that has to be submitted, and if an issue comes up, they're going to already have an idea about whether that issue can be resolved or not, and what's the best way to approach the issue. So that's the way you go about approval. Once you've submitted everything, turnaround time is about 30 days, roughly. As of right now, the approval's good for 2 years. Then you have to recertify. But if you've done it once, the recertification, you maintain the file, you may have a couple things to change, the number of delinquencies, things of that nature. The vast majority of what you have, however, can just be resubmitted and you're done. And that's it. There have been pushes to extend that 2-year period, and there is some indication FHA is considering, HUD is considering extending that 2 years to a longer period of time, perhaps doubling it to 4 years. That would be nice because I think it would encourage more people to do it. And really, that's it. So if you either have remaining questions for Mike or you have any questions for me, feel free.
I actually have a two-pronged question. My association did at one point have FHA, it did expire because of our reserve funding. We're interested in obtaining FHA again. Does it matter to FHA if it's an owner occupied or if the purchaser is using it for investment purposes?
The answer is it does matter because you can't have more than 50% of the units non-owner occupied. Okay, so if you're in that situation, they won't do it.
I'm concerned that if I really want people that want to live in the building to get FHA approval, I don't want people that are using it for investment purposes to buy into the building. I'd much rather have owner occupied.
Yeah, well, FHA won't give a loan to somebody who's trying to get it for investment purposes. You have to be willing to occupy the unit.
Second question to that is, I have a mixed community, some old, some young.
Okay.
The older people are looking to get reverse mortgages,
Good point.
and they cannot because of the
That question, I don't know if you heard it, it was that some of the older residents are looking for reverse mortgages. Basically, the only game in town these days, there's a couple private programs, but the 98% of people who are seeking reverse mortgages are going through the FHA program. In order to go through the FHA program, you have to have project approval. And look, there's a lot of people who have a lot of equity in their homes, and maybe they need some cash. That's why they're doing it. It's not a huge risk because they'll only advance up to a certain percentage of the value of the home. But there is demand for that in communities that have people who are over 55. Absolutely. Yes, sir.
The reserve fund, if your association's reserve fund is severely underfunded, do you recommend an assessment or cost of living increase to bump it up?
Let me be clear about one thing. It's interesting. The question is interesting. So the question was, let's say you're severely underfunded in your reserve account. Do I recommend an assessment to bump it up? As a general question having nothing to do with FHA, yes, I would have some kind of deficit recovery each year that gets put into your reserve account because sooner or later the chickens are going to come home to roost and you're going to have to replace a roof, you're going to have to replace windows, you're going to have to do something that you'd have to assess the owners a large amount of money. But that doesn't stop you, the fact that you've got a deficiency in your reserve account, as long as your current budget is at least 10% of the total budget is going to capital reserves, they don't look at how much you're deficient. So the answer is yes to your question, but that doesn't stop you from getting FHA financing. Yes, sir.
Follow-up to that is,
yes.
If you have the line item and you don't fund it, will they come looking?
Well, FHA would argue that's why we have a 2-year review. Because if you come back 2 years from now and that money didn't go into the reserve account, they're going to say, no, you fooled us once, you're not going to fool us again. Yes?
Is it advantage to get condominium owners to attract FHA approval? If you are only a small 18 units, is it advantage? There's a drawback of having somebody with an FHA loan.
Right.
Even you know what I mean?
I do know what you mean, and the question was, is there an advantage in a smaller condominium, 18 units, to get FHA financing? There may be. It depends on what the units typically sell for and how big a mortgage people normally go for. So, you know, if you're selling $1 million units, FHA financing is not what most people are going to be looking for. If you're selling $300,000 units, FHA financing may very well be what people are looking for. And obviously there's a gray area in between those two, but.
There's also disadvantage when you own a property with an FHA, thing. It's hard for them to pay some of the, let's say, the assessment or even the maintenance.
That's an argument. I mean, it's,
They're limited with their income, and you cannot garnish, or you know what I mean, or put a lien on the property.
well, what you very often,
Even
that,
if they're also in the military.
that's an argument that a lot of people make. However, what you will see is frequently it's young couples who are getting FHA financing. That is the most typical, and then their income tends to be increasing over the years. So, you know, look, again, it's a choice that the board can make, but in many communities, it's still an advantage to have FHA financing. There was one more question in the back?
I actually had a question about the green card, sorry.
Yes, yes, by all means.
One problem that we've been having in management is when you pass the 5-year state inspection and the state has your management company as being responsible for it. If you're no longer managing that unit and the new management company doesn't re-register, how do you relinquish that liability as the management company?
Yeah.
How can you protect yourself?
What I've done is I write to them and tell them we no longer manage this, and here's the identity of who you ought to turn it over to. Now, whether they do it or not, I'm not sure. I mean, but I don't think there's a foolproof way to do it other than to put them on notice and have that in your file.
And Mike mentioned earlier, and I totally agree with him, make sure the management company is not shown as the owner. Because if you are, they're going to fine the management company for the violations. They're going to treat this as if it's a landlord-tenant relationship.
We're getting, we got a fine because the snow was not removed. And
By DCA?
yeah, by the state of New Jersey, I'm sorry, the town.
The town, okay, yeah.
The town sent us a fine, and we haven't managed that building for 3 years.
So you didn't just pay it?
No. All right,
Any, one more, and then we're going to have to go because there's another program starting, I think, here.
Okay, I have a two-part question. One of them was about the green card. Is this the same green card as the Section 8 green card for inspection?
No, that's different.
No.
Okay, and the second issue that I have was, does a condominium have to have Fannie Mae approval in order to get an FHA?
I'm sorry, say that
You
again.
need Fannie Mae to get FHA.
No, absolutely not. The only time you need Fannie Mae approval is if the project's under development. Then the developer has to get Fannie Mae project approval in order for people to be qualified for mortgages. Once the property is closed out, Fannie Mae just does spot loan approvals. Yeah. Okay, thank you very
Thank
much.
you all. Thanks.